Have you ever noticed how paradoxical it is that the more effort we put into explaining our position, the harder it becomes to control the situation? We were taught to believe in the power of arguments and the triumph of logic in disputes, but reality often proves otherwise. An excess of words can lead to a loss of influence. The great Carl Jung understood this like no other. Silence is not passivity, but a powerful tool of dominance. By mastering the art of being silent at the right moment, you can notice how your opponent begins to open up, revealing their true intentions and weaknesses. You are about to learn why the most insightful minds prefer not to engage in fruitless arguments, but instead take a position of observer, waiting for the right moment. And when they finally decide to speak, their words gain weight and remain in the memory of those around them for a long time. Have you ever left a discussion feeling defeated, despite seemingly exhaustive explanations? You gave arguments, made excuses, tried to prove your point, but deep down you felt that you had missed something important. This happens because silence is often more convincing than the most eloquent arguments. By giving in to impulse and starting to speak, you can create the illusion of control, but it is precisely in moments of silence that the opponent begins to truly listen. Modern society often mistakenly equates an abundance of words with strength. The more a person speaks, the more convincing they seem, the more it seems that they possess the truth. But there is also an inverse relationship. The more someone needs to justify and explain their actions, the more insecure they look in the eyes of others. In this context, silence manifests not as absence, but as a powerful inner strength. To be silent when dictated by inner conviction is not a sign of weakness, but a manifestation of dominance and self-confidence. The famous psychoanalyst Carl Jung once noted that our irritation and dislike of other people can become a key to self-knowledge. Indeed, nothing is more infuriating than being ignored and silenced in response to our words or actions. At such moments, we are forced to face those aspects of our personality that we usually project onto others. Silence is like a mirror reflecting ourselves, while words often serve only as a way to escape from the truth and distract attention. The one who speaks seeks to manage the course of events and control the situation, while silence allows one to maintain composure and inner stability. However, there is a special strength that manifests not in shouting and aggression, but in calm observation and waiting. This strength belongs to the one who no longer needs proof of their rightness, because they have reached a deep understanding of themselves and their truth. A person who knows themselves does not engage in pointless arguments and conflicts, not out of cowardice, but out of conscious choice. In this context, silence becomes a manifestation of strategic intelligence, a kind of filter that separates important things that require a response from empty provocations aimed only at provoking a reaction. Silence disarms because it offers no resistance, and at the same time exposes those who seek control. The one who needs constant confirmation of their power feels threatened by a calm and imperturbable person who does not succumb to provocations. Such changes often cause confusion in people who do not have strong spirits. They subconsciously prepare for open combat, crave verbal sparring, where each statement becomes a weapon. However, faced with impenetrable silence, they lose their orientation. In confusion, they begin to look for excuses, inadvertently demonstrating their insecurity and vainly trying to fill the void that has formed around them. However, true silence is not just a tactic. Its strength lies in sincerity, in the conscious decision not to resort to manipulation, but to support what does not need verbal expression. After all, there are truths that do not require explanation. They are affirmed by the calmness and confidence of a person living in harmony with them. It is in this inner space, free from fuss and noise, that true strength manifests itself, silent, unwavering, and unmistakable. Silence is not a manifestation of weakness, but a conscious choice of a person who understands that an immediate reaction under the influence of emotions can lead to a loss of self-control. The ability to restrain oneself reveals a high level of emotional intelligence, a silent wisdom that speaks more than any arguments. By observing and analyzing the situation, a person is able to penetrate the essence of what is happening, grasping not only what is said aloud, but also what is carefully hidden. Silence slows down the course of time, allowing for a deeper understanding of what is happening. While the ego strives for victory, silence is aimed at achieving understanding. Giving in to impulsive urges, a person tries to control the situation, but it is silence that helps to gain clarity and see the true picture. Carl Jung once noted that until a person becomes aware of their internal processes, their unconscious will determine their life, and they will call it fate. This statement exposes a harsh reality. Whoever does not recognize their own triggers becomes a puppet in their hands. Excessive talkativeness is one such trigger, manifesting as an instant reaction, a desire to insist on being right, and an overwhelming urge to explain everything. Often these impulses come from the unconscious, which is frantically trying to maintain control. However, awareness provides a person with the opportunity to pause. This pause, even fleeting, becomes a space of power, because it is in this interval between sensation and word that the self is born. By developing this ability, a person begins to realize that many provocations do not require a response, because they are addressed not to their true self, but to the ego. A calm self does not succumb to these dialogues. Emotional intelligence is not about having ready answers to all questions, but about understanding when an answer is not required at all. It is the ability to withstand the discomfort of silence, not rushing to fill it with words, realizing that a screaming person has usually already lost the ability to listen. The one who knows how to listen, even in silence, is always in a more advantageous position. Obviously, the art of keeping silent requires diligent practice and a rethinking of the established idea that silence is tantamount to defeat. It is necessary to learn to endure the inner anxiety that arises from the lack of an immediate reaction. However, over time, silence turns into a reliable refuge, into a personal space where there is no need for protection, where energy is carefully preserved for truly significant purposes. And then, when the moment comes to speak, words are born from the very depths of the soul, direct, sincere, and devoid of all superfluity. After all, the one who knows how to master silence speaks not to prove their point, but to move forward with confidence and accuracy, and not in haste and bustle. Most of the words spoken come from the ego, this quick, impulsive entity striving for self-affirmation. The ego seeks to explain, defend itself, control the created image, and fears silence because in silence there are no guarantees, no story to maintain, no distractions to hide behind, and it is at this moment that the self comes into play. The self, in Jungian psychology, represents the deepest center of the psyche, which does not compete with the ego, but transcends it. While the ego craves recognition, the self strives for consistency. While the ego produces noise and bustle, the self radiates presence. And this presence is not imposed, but supported, often in silence. At certain moments in life, silence becomes not just a pause, but a manifestation of deep awareness. It is the ability to restrain the impulses of the ego, to listen to what is happening without the obsessive need to answer, to observe the world without dissolving in it, and to make choices without succumbing to fleeting passions. It is the inner resilience of a person who is able to distinguish between mental wounds that require an immediate reaction and the truth that needs to be given space to unfold. Let us recall the image of the wise king who speaks little because his authority does not need loud statements. His very presence speaks volumes, and when he utters words, they change the world not because of a desire to impress, but because they are born from the depths of thoughtful, felt, and experienced experience. He speaks only when there is really something to say. The ego, on the other hand, seeks to insist on its own at all costs, and often speaks only to drown out its own insecurity. The more wounded the ego, the more it justifies itself. The more it experiences fear, the more desperately it tries to control the course of events. The true self knows how to wait, listening to internal responses but not identifying with them. The distinction between active reaction and calm observation, although subtle, is of great importance, especially when expressed in silence. If a person is able to refrain from answering not out of fear, but thanks to awareness, when they feel the need to speak out, but prefer to simply be present, this indicates their psychological maturity and inner independence. In such situations, knowing how to speak less does not mean losing one's voice but gaining confidence. This allows words to come from that depth of personality that does not need to be constantly defended. When the self takes the place of the ego, the word becomes a meaningful gesture and silence becomes a source of strength. Not all answers are born from the present moment. Reactions often stem from old, unhealed emotional wounds. When someone provokes, criticizes, or embarrasses a person, the reaction is often turbulent, defensive, and even excessive. It's not just the present self speaking in such moments, but also the traumatized part of the psyche that has been touched. Carl Jung called this part of the personality a complex. Complexes are autonomous emotional centers hidden in the unconscious. They have their own life, feelings, and memories. When activated, they take control of a person's behavior and cause them to react as if they are reliving the trauma, even if the current situation does not justify such a vehement reaction. Imagine a person whose soul is burdened by a perceived injustice. Just a shadow of accusation, even the slightest, is enough to trigger a storm of indignation, sarcastic irony, or a desire to avoid confrontation. Their voice changes, a sullenness appears in their behavior, and they always have a wealth of counter-arguments at their disposal. They react not only to the current situation, but also to defend old wounds that have long left their scars. An inferiority complex takes over their speech and actions. As the famous psychologist Carl Jung said, "It's impossible to get rid of a complex by direct confrontation. It must be carefully studied and understood." And this process begins with silence. Instead of an immediate reaction, a person should stop and ask themselves, who wants to speak now? Is it their conscious self or an old trauma that is desperately trying to defend itself? Silence in this case is not just the absence of words, it is a deep inner listening, close attention to one's body, to the tension and urgency that arise within. When the impulse is too strong, it almost always indicates an ancient pain that is seeking a way out. If a person responds without realizing it, the complex will only intensify, fueled by unconscious reactivity. However, when a person chooses silence, not as a way of suppressing, but as a tool of observation, transformation occurs. They become an outside observer of their feelings and emotions, which allows them to make a conscious choice rather than acting under the influence of old traumas. A person begins to draw a clear line between personal beliefs and established truths, between sincere expression and impulsive outburst. Internal contradictions lose their dominant role, turning into an object for reflection. The dawn of emotional independence arrives when it is realized that not every emotional response requires immediate verbal expression, that not every emotional wound should result in a defensive reaction, and that silence in certain situations is not a sign of weakness, but a manifestation of maturity and understanding. After all, only those who can listen to their inner voice can make a conscious choice about what to convey to others. Often, public speaking is dictated not by deep-seated beliefs, but by a desire to conform to a created image in order to earn recognition and approval. Carl Jung called this image persona, the social mask that a person uses to adapt to society. This mechanism is useful. It provides protection, facilitates interaction, and helps to perform various social roles. However, sometimes this mask takes on too much. When speech becomes hasty, self-assured, when there is a need for admiration or confirmation, it is most likely not the true self speaking, but the persona striving to maintain its position. The persona of a smart, righteous, spiritually developed or balanced person needs constant confirmation of its image, so it talks a lot, explains, defends, demonstrates, and proves its rightness. However, the shadow side of the personality, everything that a person carefully hides in the depths of the subconscious, remains unsaid. That is why genuine silence evokes such a strong fear. In silence, familiar masks disappear, arguments recede, and the carefully constructed life scenario vanishes, exposing the true essence of the person. Sometimes this is what makes people avoid silence, because it mercilessly exposes everything that the persona seeks to hide from prying eyes. The well-known psychologist Carl Jung claimed that confrontation with the shadow is inevitable for those who strive for authenticity. Deep silence, born of conscious presence, becomes a powerful arena for this fateful encounter. In silence, the persona loses its power and the shadow begins to manifest itself, sometimes in the form of inexplicable discomfort, chaotic thoughts, ancient fears, and long-forgotten feelings of guilt. This is why many people prefer to fill the void with meaningless words, not out of arrogance, but because of deep-seated fear. In silence, control over the situation slips away, and a picture emerges that is not always attractive and orderly, but truthful. When a person learns to recognize the moments when their speech is dictated by the need to maintain a certain image, rather than a sincere desire to express themselves, changes will begin in their life. They will learn to listen to their inner voice and choose only the words that truly need to be spoken. At this point, silence becomes a mirror that is not always understood by others. After all, when a person speaks little, but each word is full of meaning and integrity, their presence shatters the masks of others. This is where true power lies, not in manipulating others, but in being able to resist manipulation from anything that is not authentic and essential. There are individuals whose mere presence in any space transforms it, as if an invisible wave washes through the air. And it's not about deliberate efforts or ostentatious gestures, but about the very aura they exude. They don't need to introduce themselves or prove their significance. Their presence speaks for itself. This phenomenon arises not from an inflated ego seeking praise, but from the depths of inner stillness, when a person feels self-sufficiency and integrity. Such a quiet presence is fundamentally different from an intrusive charisma that seeks to charm and attract attention. It doesn't need approval, doesn't strive to please, it simply is. And it is this unconditional nature that evokes genuine respect. This kind of behavior is a reflection of an inner world where peace has reigned, where there is no need to seek oneself in the external world, since the roots have already firmly taken hold within. As Carl Jung said, the unconscious responds not to explanations but to symbols, and silence is one of the most powerful symbols, possessing a special depth. It hints at something more than lies on the surface, creating a space in which others are forced to rethink their position. In silence, the one who possesses true presence begins to direct the energy of the surrounding space, not out of a desire for control, but from a state of inner harmony. This power is born not from spoken words, but from the inner support that a person cultivates within themselves. To maintain this support, meticulous work is needed to recognize one's own value, independent of external validation. A person who constantly demands explanations reveals the instability of their belief in their own strength. The one who chooses silence filled with confidence seems to have stopped bargaining with internal kolobaniami. In this context, silence appears not simply as the physical absence of sounds, but as a manifestation of inner integrity and self-sufficiency. It is the silence of a person who, having listened to themselves, no longer needs approval from the outside. Such silence is devoid of coldness. On the contrary, it is a clear and concise presence, a restrained but palpable energy, reminiscent of a creative upswing. Those around feel this power, but are not always able to recognize it. This is the fundamental difference between a simple appearance and a true presence. Appearance only attracts fleeting attention, while presence is able to transform the surrounding atmosphere. This art cannot be learned through memorized techniques. It is cultivated only through deep self-knowledge. When an individual manages to remain silent without feeling the need for excuses, they not only gain inner freedom but also become a kind of guide for others. And this happens not out of a desire for leadership, but because their silence begins to speak more convincingly than any words. After all, not everything we broadcast to the world is expressed verbally. A significant part of our presence manifests through body language, posture, breathing, rhythm of movements, gaze, even before a word is spoken. We are constantly sending signals that inform others about our essence, emotional state, and degree of inner harmony. And when the voice of the ego falls silent, the body gains the ability to speak with greater frankness. The unspoken language of the body possesses a subtle but powerful force, a carefully calibrated reaction speed, a gaze that supports without causing confrontation, a posture that occupies space without arrogance. All this creates a tangible effect. This is a manifestation of power that doesn't need to shout, but is asserted naturally, doesn't demand respect, but earns it organically. People who are in harmony with their emotions don't need hasty excuses. They have their own rhythm. They speak when they decide to, not when they are pushed to. They know how to wait, listen attentively, and even in silence their presence speaks volumes. Their motto, "I don't react, I choose." This style of communication carries enormous symbolic weight as it testifies to inner self-possession, and one who possesses self-control is difficult to subdue. Carl Jung deeply understood the significance of nonverbal signals. In his view, everything in the psyche is reflected in symbolic form, including body language. When the ego experiences anxiety, the body immediately signals it: restless hand movements, a quickened voice, tense shoulders. However, when the I takes over, the body relaxes, and this calmness is subconsciously perceived by others as a sign of confidence and security. Silence, therefore, is not simply the absence of words, but a harmonious correspondence between the inner state and external manifestation. When the body is freed from the need to defend itself, it begins to radiate genuine trust, which is perceived even before it can be explained. One who masters their body influences the environment not through manipulation, but through their ability to guide. This is the difference between a person who tries to convince with words and one who convinces with their integrity. The body reveals the truth that words sometimes try to hide. Therefore, it is not enough to keep silent externally. It is necessary to achieve inner peace. This type of silent communication cannot be imitated. It is born from constant internal dialogue, from the habit of not rushing, from a deep breath before acting, and, above all, from the awareness that not all questions need a verbal answer. Often, it is the attitude of a person who maintains their presence in silence, aware of their identity, even without uttering a word, that has a transformative effect on the environment. It is impossible to discuss silence as a tool of power without referring to Robert Greene's 48 Laws of Power. This book made the author reconsider their views on silence and the word. Upon first reading, it seemed provocative and even caused discomfort, but over time the realization came that it only brings to the surface what is constantly happening in people's subconscious. One of the most memorable ideas is this: always say less than necessary. This phrase, which seems like ordinary communication advice, hides a deep psychological understanding. According to Greene, excessive talkativeness is a betrayal of oneself. Impulsive speech reveals insecurity, excessive justifications provide the interlocutor with excessive information, and attempts to convince with many words are often an attempt to convince oneself. In this context, terseness is not an omission, but a defense, observation before action, a refusal to put one's intentions on a platter. Strategically silent people create tension and space, allowing others to open up and fill the silence with their projections and mistakes, which they would not be able to hide if they were carefully listened to. Greene shows how silence positions a person, causing irritation because it deprives the interlocutor of a comfort zone. But this is precisely its effectiveness. Silence demonstrates the degree of internal control of the one who maintains it. Interestingly, the more another person speaks, the more disorganized they become, especially if they are trying to manipulate, dominate, or gain the upper hand in an argument. Power is viewed not only in a social, but also in a deeply psychological aspect. Possessing silence allows one to control their ego, freeing them from the need to constantly answer, prove, or explain anything. A person gains the ability to choose the time and manner of expressing their thoughts, which gives each word special significance. In this context, a parallel can be drawn between the concept of inner presence proposed by Jung and the strategic presence that Greene speaks of. Their combination gives rise to a type of silence that has an impact without raising the voice. The idea of the power of silence is supported not only by these thinkers. The centuries-old wisdom of Taoism, which originated more than 2,000 years ago, also emphasizes the importance of silence. The ancient Chinese master of Taoism, Lao Tzu, argued that the one who knows does not speak, and the one who speaks does not know. In Taoism, silence is viewed not as inaction, but as a way of connecting with essence. The sage does not need proof of their worth. Their actions stem from a presence that is quite sufficient. Silence in this context symbolizes harmony with the natural course of things, and excessive talkativeness is seen as a disruption of the rhythm of life. The 17th-century French philosopher, mathematician and theologian Blaise Pascal wrote that all the troubles in the world come from a person's inability to remain in silence alone with themselves. For him, silence served as a gateway to self-knowledge. Difficulties in maintaining silence, both external and internal, indicate a restless mind, detached from itself. Pascal argued that true equilibrium is achieved when a person is able to abide in their presence, without needing external noise to escape from themselves. There are many other examples of philosophers, spiritual teachers, neuroscientists and therapists who, each in their own way, have come to the same conclusion. Silence born of awareness has power and is key to authority. Perhaps the most paradoxical secret is that the more a person becomes silent inside, the more the world pays attention to what they represent on the outside. The phenomenon of silence has an amazing ability to disorient an interlocutor, as if reflecting them in a mirror. The lack of reaction forces the speaker to involuntarily listen to their own words, analyze their meaning and impact. By not filling the communicative space, silence encourages the other person to delve into deeper self-disclosure. Isolation from the verbal battle, forcing the opponent to face the echo of their own statements, is not simple passivity, but a subtle psychological maneuver. Many people subconsciously prepare for confrontation, expecting counter-arguments, defensive retorts, or open opposition, and when instead they come up against a wall of silence, their expectations are shattered and they lose their usual support. Some, trying to unbalance the silent person, resort to even more provocative statements, while others, on the contrary, get lost in the flow of their own speech, finding no response. Silence disarms because it destroys familiar patterns of interaction, deprives the interlocutor of the opportunity to play the role of an opponent, and forces them to improvise. It is in this improvisation, devoid of pre-prepared scenarios, that true intentions and hidden motives are most clearly revealed, as if masks fall, exposing the true face. Skillfully used silence is not a sign of retreat or weakness, but a way to dominate the communicative space. It allows one not to impose their point of view, but to occupy a certain position, not to encourage destructive behavior, but to draw attention to the essence of the problem. However, to achieve this effect, genuine presence and awareness are required. Silence born of uncertainty or confusion does not have the same effect as silence born of clarity and a deep understanding of the situation. The interlocutor unmistakably feels the difference between these two states. Silence dictated by wounded pride is an escape from reality, while silence born of a sense of inner integrity and self-sufficiency has great power. In this regard, Carl Jung's words about the transcendent function as a process of integrating opposites, allowing one to achieve harmony and wholeness of personality, come to mind. The internal confrontation between the impulse for immediate reaction and the desire to maintain internal balance creates a fertile ground for the development of this conflict in silence. Instead of leaning to one side, it is recommended to maintain this tension, because it is from it that something fundamentally new can arise. A similar principle applies in interpersonal relationships. By refraining from hasty explanations, attempts at persuasion, or aggressive attacks, a person creates a space in which their interlocutor can reveal their inner complexes. This is often observed in discussions when one of the participants remains silent and the other, feeling discomfort from the resulting emptiness, begins to contradict themselves, justify unjustifiable actions, and demonstrate what they did not initially plan to show. It is important to note that this is not manipulation, but rather a manifestation of clarity. It is an understanding that it is not always necessary to enter the game, and that there may be more power in maintaining silence than in winning a verbal battle. Often, the one who consciously chooses silence occupies a more advantageous position, not to suppress another, but to avoid losing themselves. Silence, disarming those around them, simultaneously reveals the person themselves, because in it they realize how much they no longer need to react to external stimuli, and this in itself is liberation. However, it should be remembered that not all silence is a conscious choice. For many people, silence hurts not because of a lack of words, but because the emptiness reminds them of something too ancient and deeply rooted to be clearly understood. In certain circumstances, when silence falls, it awakens memories of past traumas that have not yet healed. Feelings of abandonment, rejection. What is intended to be a moment of respite turns into a harbinger of danger, and then the desire to speak, explain, fill the void, becomes an instinct for self-preservation. Some people experience a panicky dread of silence because it exposes what has been experienced without proper acceptance and understanding. Children whose needs were ignored, adults whose words went unheard, those who had to desperately call for attention just to assert their existence. This cry, dictated by the need to survive, does not disappear without a trace. It merely transforms, taking on other forms. It can manifest as obsessive thoughts, as anxiety in relationships with loved ones, as an irrational fear of loneliness, or a fear of being misunderstood by others. As Carl Jung stated, the healing process begins with accepting reality as it is, and accepting silence is an integral part of this process, not silence as a kind of vacuum and emptiness, but as fertile ground in which the ability to hear can be born and flourish. For those who carry the burden of past traumas, maintaining silence is no easy task, but it can be a turning point, as silence fosters the ability to endure one's own presence without feeling an acute need to defend oneself. The fear of silence often stems from the fear of hearing one's body, one's pain, questions for which there are no answers yet. But fleeing from this encounter with oneself only keeps the trauma active. And it is in silence, when external stimuli recede into the background, that the inner voice begins to sound. And even if that voice trembles with fear and uncertainty, it must be heard and accepted. Self-control originates not in the harsh suppression of emotions, but in the ability to steadfastly endure emerging experiences. Maintaining silence in the face of provocation is no easy task, but it is even more difficult to remain silent when faced with the ghosts of the past. However, one who is able to refrain, even for a moment, from responding to a mental wound with a new wave of negative emotions has already embarked on the path to breaking out of the vicious cycle. In this context, silence is a manifestation of true courage. It is an affirmation to oneself. I am here, and I am ready to listen. And in this process, an internal restructuring occurs. The cry of the soul gradually loses its power, fear becomes more tolerable, and silence ceases to be perceived as a threat, turning into a kind of portal. After all, when a person stops running away from themselves, their speech acquires a completely different quality. It is no longer dictated by despair, but emanates from a sense of inner wholeness, and this changes the situation dramatically. Ultimately, silence is not just the absence of sounds, it is the presence of oneself. It allows one to reveal what remains when there is no need to convince, justify, impress, or prevail. What remains when a person simply exists, and this, as simple as it may sound, is the culmination of a profound process of self-discovery. After all, only those who have truly listened to themselves are able to endure silence without fear. In the public consciousness, there is still a misconception that silence is a sign of weakness, a sign of a lack of arguments and a symbol of defeat. However, true strength manifests itself in a person's ability to do without the need to have the last word in an argument or discussion. Those who feel a constant need to speak out often try to defend their position, while conscious silence is an act of self-support, not an escape from reality. As the eminent psychologist Carl Jung noted, one should not waste effort on defending what requires constant defense. This statement is true for both personal beliefs and the images and interpretations of events created by a person. The need for continuous reinforcement indicates internal fragility. In contrast, silence becomes the lot of those who have overcome the need for constant protection and affirmation. It indicates the integrity, strength, and integration of the personality. True silence comes when the ego gives way to the self, allowing a person to free themselves from the need to react to every event, explain their actions, and prove their worth. At this moment, the conscious decision to be present in the moment comes, allowing the energy of self-expression to manifest naturally. Such silence is not an escape from problems but a conscious choice of position. It is not flight, but strategic positioning, emanating from the inner center and maintaining stability even in the face of external chaos. This silence has the ability to wait, observe, and act at the most appropriate moment. And when it declares itself, every word born from the depths of silence carries weight and significance, avoiding empty chatter and unnecessary words. The art of silence is a deep awareness of one's own personality, not requiring external approval. It is the ability to avoid meaningless conflicts caused by provocations. It's a conscious choice of where to focus your attention, allowing you to protect your inner world from external stimuli. Perhaps this is the simple yet effective secret. The ability to remain silent in the face of provocations, doubts, and shortcomings is evidence of personal growth. Next time someone tries to throw you off balance, disrupt your peace, or provoke a reaction, it is recommended to remain silent and observe whose voice is louder, the voice of reason or the voice of ego.